Good evening, everyone. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about this centerpiece, the SRP313K2, second generation monster, commonly known as the Dracula or the vampire monster. But first I'd like to start with a little bit of history that I have with Seiko watches, just so you can get an understanding of my perspective. My first automatic piece was an Invicta with a Seiko-based movement, one of the Rolex homages. And I liked that watch, and I had no problem with it. I dove with it on several occasions. It worked great for me. But I wanted something with a little bit more of a history and originality to it. So I started shopping. Now, the Turtle didn't exist yet. This is a few years ago, back in the probably mid-2014 time range. But these two watches did exist. And at the time I was more comparing the orange monster with the SKX009, but for the sake of this comparison they're both effectively the same. I ended up going with the 009 because at the time I was relatively new to watches, and this design seemed a little bit ugly to me. Not necessarily ugly, but a little bit too garish for an everyday watch. So I ended up going with the Seiko SKX009. Tried it out in the stock bracelet, liked it on the stock bracelet, tried it on a Super Oyster, on some various Bonetto Santorini straps like the one it's on right now. And I liked it, but the lume on it, while excellent, was just not quite what I was looking for in a field watch, since I'm frequently out doing construction at night, or I was at the time, and still do occasionally. And the watch is very durable. I've jackhammered with it, I've used sawzalls with it, and it's held up no problem. But the lume and just a few of the case features, I just wanted something a little different. I had been on a watch tour with Random Rob and some others with an orange monster and liked it at the time, but once again unfortunately didn't get it. And so I decided to start a second tour on Independent Watch Aficionados for this watch, the Dracula monster. Since at the time, and currently they're all currently sold out on Long Island Watch, which is where I get most of my Seikos, but this one was in stock at the time. So we went with it, and I decided the next day after I got the tour watch in, I was the first person with the watch, that I had to get one for myself. So I went ahead and ordered one. We'll take a quick pause for a second to appreciate the little monster salute we're getting right here. Makes this nice little rocket ship every hour. But I had decided I had to get one for myself. Random Rob, for years now, or at least the year plus that we've known each other, has been talking up the monster as the ultimate watch. And I've always kind of thought so, but I've been put off by the obviously very modern and original looking design. And so I finally got one. And retired this as an everyday piece, and I still wear it occasionally, but mostly it's just like a fun watch for me now, and I'll definitely take it diving when I go diving, but it's more of a memory watch and a watch to wear just for fun. And this has become my everyday watch, along with the Paddy Turtle. The Paddy Turtle I'll be reviewing at a later date, but I wanted to include it here for comparison. So one of the things that originally put me off about this watch, besides the design, was the size. It's listed as being somewhat larger than the Monster, or than the SKX, and so I was like, well, the SKX is already a big enough watch for me. I have only just under a 7-inch wrist, and I like smaller vintage watches, so I said, well, the SKX is already huge, and I probably shouldn't try this Monster. But the Monster is actually not much different in size realistically to the SKX. I did some caliper measurements on them, and the diameter is nearly the same. The SKX is 42.43 and the Monster is 42.4. It's different than the Seiko measurements, but those are what I got with my calipers. The lug is a little longer on the Monster at 47.74 over 45.71, all in millimeters. But the advantage of the Monster is that the way the bracelet comes off is it's extremely short. Now the SKX is already very short on the lugs, but the Monster is even more short because it doesn't actually have curved end links. So the first link, the end link of the watch, bracelet is allowed to swing freely, whereas normally on an SKX you'd have an end link and then the first link would swing freely after it. So the Monster actually wears a little bit smaller on my wrist, partially also due to the thick bezel, than the SKX does. The Monster is also slightly thinner. The SKX is about 13.5 millimeters thick, and it appears thick due to the curvature of the case and the deep case back and bezel, whereas due to the somewhat shrouded and integrated case appearance of the Monster, it's 12.9 millimeter thickness, which is only half a millimeter difference, but you feel it. Does definitely feel thinner on the wrist. So it's definitely a wearable watch. So for anyone who thinks that they can't wear a watch of this size, I'd be willing to bet that you can. And this is coming from someone who likes to routinely wear 32 to 36 millimeter vintage watches. It's also a fairly heavy watch. It's 88 grams with the head only, and with the stock bracelet 167 grams. So that means that the bracelet is actually almost the same at 78 grams for weight compared to the watch head. And this leads to an extremely balanced design on the wrist. Go ahead and put it on. I gotta put the diver's extension back in. Put it on. It feels extremely comfortable on the wrist due to this tapered bracelet and the short end link configuration I mentioned earlier, and the weight of the bracelet. So it wears very, very comfortably, far more comfortably, and I love the stock bracelet on the SKX, but this does wear far more comfortably, I think due to that nicely tapering, fairly unique, like a tank tread pattern, with the polished centerpieces, but all one-piece links versus the Jubilee bracelet that comes with the SKX. And the Jubilee bracelet is very comfortable, but the watch wears somewhat looser. I prefer my watches to be fairly tight on the wrist, and the Jubilee bracelets have a lot more flex to them. This is a Super Jubilee, but it still has a lot of flex, pretty similar to what the SKX bracelet has. So the movement on this watch is a 4R36, so it's the 7S26 movement of the SKX with some modifications to allow for hacking and hand winding. Identical power reserve around 40 hours. I've never tested mine. At the day date, it's got excellent lume. I don't have the capability to do a lume shot right now, but you can Google it. Any Monster, especially these second generation Monsters with the tooth bezel or the tooth chapter indices, has incredible lume. Probably the best out of any watch I've ever held, including some Omegas, some Glycine, and other various Swiss watches. You're not going to be left in the dark with this. One other thing I'd like to note as a diver is that the lume pip on the bezel for this watch is far better than the SKX, which is still respectable, and also the Patty Turtle, which the bezels on these are basically the same to the SKX. But the lume pip is much brighter on this one, which allows you in murky or dark water to be able to read the bezel for your dive timing much better. Speaking of the bezel is all steel, filled in with paint. So far mine's not knocked up any scratches, and I'm pretty rough on my watches. The action, you only have the space between here and here on both sides to move the bezel, as the top and bottom portions are shrouded to protect you from accidentally knocking it. It turns very smoothly. The sound is a little muted, and I kind of like more of a definitive click, and there is a little bit of play, but it's all aligned well. It turns well. It's very legible due to the large size of the bezel. I don't really have any complaints with this bezel. I would like perhaps more of a definitive click compared to that kind of muted soft click, but that's really just splitting hairs on a watch that retails right now for about $240. So it has pierced lugs, which I really like. It makes it easy to change the bracelet if I feel like putting a NATO on it, or if I'm going to be getting dirty or something and I want to get a rubber strap on it. 4 o'clock crown, unsigned. It's nicely knurled. It's very smooth. Much smoother than my SKX in the same price point. Springs out, which is nice. Nice definitive feeling when you crank it on, you can hear it winding when you crank it on. The fold-over clasp is a typical Prospex affair. Double push deployant with a fold-over safety. Does have a diver's extension. It's not integral to the bracelet. It's right here. You would deploy it by pulling down on this part and then pushing away, and it releases the deployant. Gives it about probably about a link's worth of extra space, so fine for probably up to a 5 mil wetsuit. Anything larger than that, you'd probably have to go to a rubber strap, which, in all honesty, unless I'm diving in the tropics, I'm probably going to be wearing a rubber strap on this watch anyway. A lot of people complain about these fold-over stamped Seiko deployant clasps. I don't have any problem with them. It's not too squeaky. The bracelet is excellent. It's pin and collar. So the whole setup to me is totally acceptable, especially for this price point. And I've used the very well regarded Omega Bond bracelet and Speedy bracelet clasps, and I honestly was not as much of a fan of them. They're thinner marginally, but they have no micro adjust, which is really nice to have. The diver's extension was prone to getting too easily flopped out, so anytime you opened the clasp, and the diver's extension on that bracelet normally resides under here, the diver's extension would want to pop out just due to the age of the watch. So I really like the Seiko clasps. I don't have any problem with them. They are stamped, but they work, and they're not too prone to breaking. I haven't heard too many of them fail. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. The red, the indices are applied. It's hard to tell. Let's see if I can get this to zoom focus on this point. There we go. The indices are applied. They kind of inset nicely into that very thick chapter ring, and they're surrounded on this model by red. At first I thought that'd be kind of tacky looking, but I think it is nice. It aids the legibility of the watch. The only downside to the red is, the matching red on the hands, is that you have a hard time sometimes in the dark seeing it on a watch like the SKX, where the hands are chromed around the loom. When it's dark out, you can still kind of make out that chrome. If it's in between where the loom is kicking in, where it's not quite, it's in twilight, it's pretty easy to catch the chrome on those hands. The Paddy also has a chromed hour hand, but it has the red surround like a Dracula on the minute hand. Still perfectly legible, but I do, as much as I love the red, I do kind of miss the chromed look of other dive watches' hands. I haven't dove with this watch yet. I'm hoping to possibly in a few weeks, in which case I will get back on how it dives, but I imagine it'll dive totally fine. My big complaint on a lot of dive watches is the bezel, because it's not easily gripped. I got my certification in cold water, and so we're wearing very thick gloves. And a bezel like this is great. Even though it's a little thin, it's real easy to turn. Has real positive engagement. But the Omega Seamaster I had, the bezel was pretty much useless underwater. You could hardly turn it on land. You had to push really hard down on it to turn it, never mind with gloves on in cold water. And since I mostly shore dive, that was difficult, because I'm probably going to swim out to my dive location and then turn the bezel to start the time and then descend. So it's important to me to be able to adjust the bezel in the water with gear on. And I realize that many people don't dive with these pieces, but to me they're designed as dive watches. They're ISO certified dive watches, and this one is in the Prospex line, so it's considered a professional specification diver, even though it is only an air diver and not a saturation diver. But I would expect that they would take the time to design the bezel to be what I would like for a diver, and I'd imagine what most other people would prefer in a diver, which is easily adjustable and very grippable, but not at the risk of being bumped. The only downside to this one is it's pretty easy to bump. I've regularly come home at the end of the day to see it looking like this, which that's just sitting at a desk all day and doing maybe some light work outside. So that's a little bit unnerving to me, whereas this one, the shrouding does help it so it doesn't really ever get, I don't think I've ever had it get knocked And diving, people think, oh, well, if you're underwater, it's not a big deal. But when you're diving underwater in heavy current, I apologize for the camera moving. When you're diving underwater in heavy current, it's real easy to get your arm knocked against things, especially when you're diving through like a rock field underwater, or maybe through a little small canyon and coral or something like that. It's real easy to knock your wrist against things, even especially wreck diving. Your hands aren't really, you don't feel like you're as spatially oriented when you're at depth, so it's real easy to bang against things, which is why having a really nice protective bezel, and a very shatter-resistant glass. This is a Hardlex crystal. I prefer that over a sapphire in a dive watch because it's much more shatter-resistant. And I'd rather have a scratched bezel or a scratched crystal that doesn't shatter than banging my wrist against a hard rock underwater and having it shatter, and then my watch is done, my dive is done. So it's an excellent diver, 200 meter water resistant. That's as much as anyone needs as far as air diving. If you're a diver that's using trimix or anything like that and you're going deep, then you're probably in a hard suit anyway, or you're saturation bell diving and you have very high-end watches like a Marine Master that you're using. So this watch meets any amateur diver's needs, meets any construction worker's needs, and definitely would be fine for anyone in the military who looks for an analog field watch. That's what I use this for. And I'd be completely comfortable taking on this on a deployment or anything like that. The movements in these watches are very robust. And so far, I've had no complaints with this watch. Everything is very comfortable. Everything works the way it should. I don't have any hiccups. I don't have loom problems. The loom is incredible. So I'm very excited to own this watch, and I definitely am on the lookout for an orange monster at some point, just because the orange monster has that iconic look. But if you're looking for something a little more conservative that you can wear maybe in an office, I wouldn't necessarily wear this with a suit, but if you're a more avant-garde kind of person, I think you could pull it off. It's thin, it fits under a cuff as long as you're not incredibly small. And otherwise, I think it looks very fresh and very instantly recognizable. Anyone that is into watches will know what this is if you're wearing it. So that's about all I have to say about this watch. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. I'll probably post an update later on with my thoughts as I wear the watch more. It's definitely getting daily use with me, and should be taking it on a dive hopefully fairly soon, and probably taking on a deployment within the next year, so we'll see how it holds up. Thanks very much and have a great night. Bye.